First of all, just something to mention is that we're not going to be going in at the base level of Octopus. We've got some great getting started guides in our documentation, and we've also got some great recordings of Octopus 101 webinars. So just to get you, a good grounding in the Octopus terminology and application and everything. Secondly, you don't need to be a developer to write these API scripts. We've got some members of our team who are ops people, and they're happily writing scripts because we've got so many bits of documentation and samples and things to be sort of looking at and working out how to use it. Right, onto the agenda. First of all, what is the Octopus API and why it's useful? Mark's going to address this and just give us an overview of it and before we delve into it. Next, I'm going to take a look at authenticating against the API using API keys and some new additions in the next version that's coming out fairly soon of Octopus. Then we'll go back to Mark and he'll take a look at different ways that you can interact with the API. And then after that, we'll delve a little bit deeper at some slightly more complex scripts where, just to give you an idea of a couple of use cases for automating some of those repetitive tasks. And then at the end, we'll answer some questions. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Jan. So first up, what I wanted to do was cover what the Octopus API is, why it's useful, and then we'll dive into a demo like Leanne said to show you how you can discover a bit more about the API endpoints. So really quick history lesson here. So Octopus has been built API first since way back when Octopus 2.0 was released. I think it was sometime in 2013. And what this really means is that Octopus is built in layers. So the API is the layer responsible for interacting with the Octopus server. Within the API is a collection of RESTful HTTP endpoints that you can call. Now, we often talk about the API powering the Octopus web portal. And really what we mean by that is that it's built on top of the API so that all of the data and operations that you can see and perform in the Octopus web portal itself can be performed over the REST API as well. In addition, if you're using the Octopus CLI, the Octopus client library, or the Terraform provider, then there's a really good chance that you're already using the REST API as these all interact with it. Now, that might be to perform specific functions like create a release with the CLI, or perhaps you're creating resources in Octopus, such as a project or environment with Terraform. And likewise, you may use a CI or a build server integrating with one of our plugins, and they can push packages, create releases, trigger deployments within Octopus in exactly the same way. These plugins also call the Octopus REST API. So we've talked a little bit about what it is, why would you want to use it, and why is it useful? So one major benefit is that you can automate the creation of Octopus resources. Now, that might be a project, a set of environments, tenants, the list goes on. So if you've ever had a time where you had to do something more than once manually in the web portal, then the REST API can more than likely come to your rescue. Now, another thing that you can do, which I don't think we talk that much about, is that you can use the API to actually extend Octopus functionality. So here in the solutions team, we often see opportunities to help solve customer problems using the REST API. Now, this typically involves writing custom scripts which interact with the REST API to create a solution. And one of the great things about this, of course, is that you can tailor these scripts to suit your own needs. It's very rare that you ever need to make changes within Octopus itself to support scripts that we've written. I'll give you a recent example. A customer wanted to be able to replace a domain name in all of their variables. So Adam from our team wrote a script leveraging the REST API to go in and search for that particular value in project variables, as well as library variable sets and project deployment processes. And I guess running a script, sorry, you go, Leanne.
Oh, I was just going to sort of jump in and say it's probably worth mentioning at this point, there are some dangers involved, if you jump too full onto interacting with the API.
Yeah, that's quite right. So I'll quote you a Spider-Man line from a movie. With great power comes great responsibility, right? So, and you could end up with things like race conditions or potentially a poorly performing Octopus server if you are continually calling the API or you're not making use of the kind of paging endpoints we have. Any endpoint that will return vast amounts of data is obviously going to have an impact on your performance. So it's it's right to be wary, and it's well worth, if you've got concerns, just to drop us an email at advice@octopus.com. So you can also use a REST API within Octopus itself. So you can build out things like step templates to extend functionality, and that might be for your deployments or your runbook processes. And again, typically that would start out as internal use as you're using it, but you could also publish them to our community library. And there are a number of community step templates which call into the Octopus API already that exist today. One of my favorites, Leanne is probably getting bored of hearing about it, is the set of Let's Encrypt step templates. So what these do is they call the Octopus REST API to query for expired certificates. Primarily, we know that Let's Encrypt certificates only have an expiry of 90 days. So these step templates will query those for those expiries and then store replacements that are issued by Let's Encrypt into the certificate library, all utilizing the REST API. Leanne, have you used the REST API in any previous roles to integrate kind of like your own applications?
Yeah. So sort of the main thing we used it for in the past was to create a custom dashboard. So for each sort of dev team, give them a dashboard to see their projects and the progress, and get a count. And you can sort of use it for a little sort of gamifying it almost within the teams of the most deployments or the number of successful deployments and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've used the API in slightly different ways. So in a previous role, we basically ensured projects were built by convention. So we actually built a website outside of Octopus, and it read XML configuration files, love them or hate them. And they interacted with the REST API, and they created our projects in exactly the same way for every project. So project to project, we'd have no kind of nasty surprises, but we'd have like steps at the start and steps at the end to kind of make sure that everyone was following the processes as we laid them out. And I guess really what this shows here, right, is that the REST API enables you to integrate Octopus at various points in any of your own applications or tooling workflows, really, where it makes sense for you. So that might be part of automating your build and deployment pipeline, or perhaps you want to retrieve data like Leanne did, and show failed deployments on your reporting dashboards. So right now, let's take a look and see the ways we can discover more about the API endpoints. So I'm just going to jump into Octopus. So this first way is kind of exploratory. So here I've got my environments tab, which is empty in my space. So my plan is to create an environment just using the web portal. So before I do, I'm just going to open up the Chrome developer tools. I'm using Chrome here. So for those of you that don't know, we've got the network tab here. And all this does is records what calls are made in this browser tab. So in our case, it's going to be a really easy way to see what API calls the Octopus web portal is making to the Octopus REST API. Leanne, have you ever used this? It's one of my favorite techniques to see what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's really useful when you are writing those scripts, because you might want to perform an action and you just want to make sure you cover everything. So it might be that it's making an API call that you weren't necessarily expecting. So it's pretty good to sort of get an idea of what's going on then, and to see the properties associated with each of those calls.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And what we find when we're using the developer tools here is we're using it in one specific place. So in environments, you're not going to be littered with calls to like projects and configuration and all those kind of things. So let's just go ahead and create our environment like you would normally. So I'll call this one development, handily using the link there, and just click save. And I'll just stop recording. So as you can see here, we've logged some requests, and here is the one I'm interested in, aptly named the environments endpoint. So what's immediately here is you can see the request URL. So this is the endpoint. So this is the environments endpoint in this space. I made the request via post, and we got a status back of 201 created. So all green, we got our environment document created as we expect. So if I scroll down a little bit, you can also see the request that was actually made by the web portal. So this is a JSON payload, but it's been parsed by the Chrome developer tools. So here you can see I've just got my name development, and we've got all of the other properties associated that the web portal wants to provide to the REST API. For now, we're just going to skip over those. And I'll just come over to the response. So here you can see I've got my environments, ID, newly created environment. It's got its name, development, descriptions, and so on. And also, just to point out, it's been modified by myself. And that's because the API key that I was using associated with my login is associated with that action when you add the environment. So it's going to have my username stamped all over it. what's really useful about this is that it's just built into the browser. So I haven't got any fancy tools. And you take this JSON request down here, and what you can do with that is you can convert that to a script or a program and automate your REST API calls. So yeah, pretty cool. So as I said earlier, like this is quite a encapsulated view. Like you can see only a smaller subset of the endpoint calls you want. What if you want to explore all of the endpoints? So Octopus provides a way of exploring these too. So when you go into the web portal, your part of the browser URL is app, and that's the main entry point into the portal. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the main entry point of the API is replacing app with API. So here's a separate tab over here where I've got just that. So what you're presented with is a list of all of the endpoints in this links property here. Now the API is designed in this way so that it's largely hypermedia driven. Now that's really just a fancy way of saying that you can follow these links that you see here in the results to navigate around the API. One thing I should point out for anyone here, there are an awful lot of endpoints here. Just because I can see them does not mean I can actually execute anything in them. Each endpoint has got its own permission checks. So let's take this top one, the accounts. Now, these aren't your login, your web portal accounts. These are infrastructure accounts. So things like username, password, tokens, SSH key pairs, Azure service principals, and the like. So what you can see here is we've got a list of 2 results, and I've got a staging account and a testing account. So you get to see all of the properties of that account. So let's say I want to drill in a bit deeper just to that one. So we'll take the self link and go back into the browser. And here we see just that one account now. And again, you see all the properties. But one thing that you'll never be able to get from the Octopus REST API, and it's worth calling out now, is sensitive values. So you can see here that there's a password, and you can see that the REST API is telling us that it's got a value, but it won't tell us what that value is. They're safely encrypted in the database. The only point at which those values will be decrypted are at deployment time, whether that be for a project release or for a runbook run. So yeah, they stay safely encrypted for us. So yeah, just go back. And I'm personally a big fan of this approach. I use it quite frequently when I want to find API endpoints and do a bit more of an exploration, see what's available, and that can help me build scripts. So one of the downsides of this set of endpoints is that it doesn't tell you what the request should look like, right? It doesn't tell you what HTTP verb you can use, whether you can use get or post, put, delete. So we also have the Swag UI. So the benefit of the Swag UI approach is that it allows you to read the API documentation in a much more humanly readable format. So you can see here for the accounts endpoint, it's got all of the different endpoints you can call, whether or not you can do it via all, ID, and also which verb you can use. So here, this is what we were doing a moment ago. We were getting a list of account resources. So we expand that one out. You can see it gives you a bit of a better description, longer description. Also tells you a bit more about the parameters. So what types are they? So these are integers in order to query which account resources you get back from this list. In addition, you get responses. So this looks very similar to the one that we just saw, where you see a list of the accounts being returned. And let's just have a quick look at creating an account resource. So this is the post equivalent. And down here, you can see this time in the parameters section, we're actually provided with an example of what that account resource JSON payload would need to look like as and when you decide to create one. And then if we go down to the responses, you can also see what a successful account resource creation looks like. Again, we have our status code of 201, so that's in the successful range. But we also have error codes. So you get examples of what types of error you might get returned. So here we've got model validation failed. So that might be that you're passing an environment ID that is invalid, or perhaps you didn't provide a body at all, in which case I'd be very surprised if Octopus magically knew what account you wanted to create. So yeah,
it's probably worth mentioning now, this Swagger UI is being worked on as we speak, sort of by the engineers, or probably not right now because they're probably all asleep in Australia, but just sort of being kept up to date and improved sort of ongoing. So it's constantly improving.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. Yeah, and before I hand it back to you, do you have any other tips or for discovering API calls or examples?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good way, those two that are covered there, and it's just sort of just getting an idea of what's there, having a look through the Swagger thing, and also sort of I go straight to the documentation as well, which I don't want to steal your fire, but I think that's really awesome.
Absolutely. Hold that thought, Leanne. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Okie dokes. So back to you to talk about API access.
Thank you very much. Okay, so what we saw there was Mark showing us sort of a little bit around the API, and he showed a sort of a quick get in the browser there, and that would have been using the identity that he was logged into Octopus in on the browser. When we're writing API scripts and things like that, we recommend using an API key. Those API keys relate to a user, so it might be a real-life human user, or it could be a service account, which is sort of something that you might use within the system. As with all security configuration, we do recommend using least privilege. So, only allowing the permissions that are required for the activity that account is going to execute, just so that, you restrict things as much as possible. Next thing is we've got quite a number of API key enhancements in 2020.6, which is the next version of Octopus due to drop fairly soon. So let's take you through there and take a look at the UI in Octopus and have a look at API keys. Okay, so I'm going to go first of all to have a look at a service account. So I'm going to go configuration users. These top two users here are service accounts, and you can tell that by the fact they've got a darker Octopus logo and that cog on there. This account is our build server user, and so this is an account that's been set up and going to be used within our sort of CI servers. I think TeamCity and GitHub Actions here. So we've used a service account here just because the Octopus administrators can then manage this account, manage the API keys associated with it, and they're not tied to a human. So, humans tend to go on holiday and things like that, and that's almost always when things go wrong or with API keys and stuff like that. So service accounts are perfect for this situation. And this build server account is in the build server team, which is associated with only those permissions that are required for the build servers. So it can push packages, push build information, create releases, all those sorts of things. So we've got two API keys associated with this. I've done this so that we've got one API key for each build server. It might be that you want to create an entire account. It depends. It's entirely up to sort of how you'd like to do that. Something to note here with the 2020.6 changes, we've got the introduction of a preview of the first 4 digits or characters of that API key. So that will show for any keys that are created after you've upgraded to 2020.6. Any keys prior to that will continue to work as per previously, but you just won't get that preview. Okay, so that's a service account. So what about if I'd like to create some of those keys for my own use? If I go up to my user profile and to the API keys, you can see I've got a number of keys in here. You can see this space cloner key. That was created prior to upgrading, so that's where we don't get to see that preview. I'm going to go ahead and create a new key now. So first of all, I'm going to put a fairly useful purpose in here. I know Mark likes to try and use that.
Yeah, I'm pretty forgetful, if I'm honest, about using or creating a purpose. Like most of the time, I just put the word testing in for general kind of solution type things we do. But yeah, it's definitely recommended to really make it meaningful because it will help you to remember. And does the purpose get used? You can't query API keys for that, can you?
That's right, yeah, it's literally just a label, and you can see I helpfully just closed that window there, so I've jumped back there. Literally just a label, doesn't get used, doesn't get encrypted as part of the key, it's literally just to help you locate what they are used for. Okay, so I'm going to call this webinar test, and then I'm going to jump on to the next section. So this is brand new for 2020.6. This is introduction of API key expiry, which is really awesome, well, in my opinion. So the default the default now is never. So if it will carry on as it did previously, that they will never expire. But what you can do is select one of these values, or as I'm going to do now, use a custom time. So I only need this one, let's say for a week. So I can set that there and click generate new. Okay, so when this dialog appears, it's important to note that this is the only time you will ever see the entire API key within Octopus. After this, you will only ever see those first 4 characters, because everywhere else it's going to be encrypted. And if it's ever sort of displaying anything to do with the API key in the user interface, it will always be masked. So at this point, you can take a copy and save it somewhere safe. I think it goes without saying, never store these in plain text, never check them into source control, try and use some kind of key vault or secrets key pass, something like that. Okay, and you can see here, we've got those first 4 characters and they are behind here in that new key. So that's creating those keys. The next thing is what happens when they come up to that expiry that we've got configured. So first thing I'm going to look at is subscriptions. Subscriptions in Octopus are a way of subscribing to various events that occur within Octopus, and you can set them up to either be notified by email, which is a digest depending on the frequency that you select, or webhook notifications. So I've configured this one to subscribe to the event category API key expiry 20-day warning. So no prizes for guessing what that is. That's going to warn us, at the 20-day prior to those API keys expiring. And we've also got these other 2 new ones. We've got API key expired and 10-day warning. I've also filtered this one by user, because I'm not particularly interested when, individual users' keys are about to expire. To be honest, that's sort of up to them to keep an eye on. What I'm really worried about for this is being notified if there's something that's going to interrupt our CI/CD pipeline. So the build server user here that I filtered by is just going to really, keep a good sort of signal to noise ratio so that we get the most important information. And one last thing to look at on those, and sorry, just to add, that was just those changes are just introduced on 2020.6. So this is one of the new features for that. And one last feature on top of that is these additional order entries for API keys. And as you can see, you get to see that preview of those first 4 characters, and you get a lot more, a lot better audit trail. And this audit trail, it doesn't get deleted, so it gives you, additional adherence to any sort of compliance regulations or things like that you've got, and you can keep track of those throughout the system. Okay, Mark, back over to you.
Yep, thank you very much. Okie dokie. So next up, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the ways that you can make API calls, and then we'll look at some examples. So as Leanne mentioned at the start, you don't need to be an expert in scripting or even with any of the languages that I'm going to show. We've got some resources that I'll touch on a little bit later that you can use to build up your knowledge, both with the script examples and the languages in general. At the heart of each of the examples is essentially creating a JSON request, taking that payload and then sending it to the Octopus REST API. And it's like most things, the more you use it, the more comfortable you'll become. So first up is we're going to talk about probably my favorite way, and that's to call the API directly. The API is exposed as a collection of endpoints. It's pretty straightforward to write some scripts to make HTTP requests to the API in a language of your choice. Leanne, I think you prefer PowerShell as your scripting language, is that right?
Yeah, I think literally just because it's the language that I've used for the longest, so it means that I can just chuck out complete scripts fairly quickly rather than sort of having to think about what I'm doing. But I have been playing with Python a little bit recently, and that's been it's been quite fun just getting to look at that and not so many $ flying around. Yeah,
$ in all the wrong places. So second one is to use the Octopus client. So for those of you that don't know, this is our open source .NET library. And that makes it easy to write programs in your .NET language of choice, or you can use it with PowerShell to write some scripts or programs, and they can call the REST API to suit your needs. Next up, you can also use the Octopus CLI. So this is the command line tool that encompasses a number of REST API calls and handily wired up functions. So one entry point for you. So, you might use it to push packages and build information to Octopus or create and deploy releases. All of these commands leverage one or more endpoints in the REST API. Quick fun fact about the Octopus CLI as well. It's actually used by most of our build server plugins, and the CLI itself actually makes use of the Octopus client. And the Octopus client in turn makes use of the REST API. So again, another good example of where we've got these layers built on top of the API. And so in each of these methods that I've just talked about, the recommended way to authenticate with the API is using an API key, just like Leanne discussed. So let's see what that looks like when we make calls to the API. So if you remember from earlier, we created an environment just in the web portal. So what I'm going to do is the same again, but this time using a tool called Postman, and then PowerShell, and then finally in C#. So let's jump to Postman. So this is a popular API tool that you can use to craft HTTP requests and see their responses. So here in the request body, you can see I've got my JSON payload ready to go, and my environment is called environment test I want to create. Very good at naming. I've got a description here that will help me identify where these environments have been created from. So in this example, I'm just creating a description via Postman request. So let's have a look at the authorization. So we go to this tab. So Postman supports a number of different ones. I'm just going to choose the API key. And here you can see I've got my key for my header, which is x-octopus-API key. And quick note, it's not case sensitive. So you can see I've got a lowercase x here. And the value for that is going to be a Postman variable. So if I hover over it, you can just see there's my API key there. And just to further show that, if I just scroll up to the headers, you can see that I've got my x-octopus API key and its API value. So that's going to go to the environments endpoint here. So we'll just go to the body and then we'll hit send. There we go. Excellent. So very similarly to the Chrome developer tools, you also get your status. So tier 1 created. We created our document, our environment in this case. And here in the response, very similarly, we get the ID of the newly created environment, the name, and the description, and all of the other properties. And again, this API key is associated with my user, so last modified by me. So yeah, there are, of course, other ways to do this. Leanne, you use a Linux operating system for work, yeah? So are there any native tools you could use to do something similar?
Yeah, so I suppose sort of at its most sort of raw terminal commands, you've got curl, and that's pretty handy if you just want to quickly fire off command. But generally, day to day, I do actually use Postman if I'm just doing those individual calls, just because it's nice and straightforward and visual and easy.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so next I'm going to show you how you can do exactly the same using PowerShell using the REST API directly. So here I've got two scripts. So I've got a REST version and I've got one that uses the Octopus client. These are both identical in terms of functionality. It's just that one makes use of the client, like I said. So you can see at the top here, I've got some variables, one for my Octopus instance URL and the other one for my API key. I'm then going to pass that here into a header variable, and that will get passed to the Octopus API here in this header property. So in a number of places, we're calling the API. So the first one is to get my space, just to get my space ID using the invoke REST method function. And I'm also going to create two environments, development and test. Now, if you remember, I already created the development environment. So what the script does is it checks to see if the environment exists first. So we make a get call to the environments endpoint, and we pass it the name of that environment. If it exists, we just carry on because there's nothing to create. And if it doesn't exist, then we then come down and we create it here using the post method. And I'm also putting in a description again, so I can identify where it's come from. So in this case, the PowerShell REST script. So I'll just run that. There you go, that was quick. So the development environment already exists, test one does not. So let's move on to the PowerShell client one. Okay, so very similar in terms of functionality as the first one. However, it's slightly different. So here we're adding a type. So this is the Octopus client library. Now I'm using this from a local path, but you can also download it from uget.org. We publish it there when we make changes to the client. Same again though, we've got the URL and the API key. The API key isn't being passed into a header in this script. Instead, it's being passed into the Octopus server endpoint object that we're creating here. And that'll in turn then authenticate using the API key. Same again, we're creating a variable for the space and the environments that I want to create. So building on the previous example, here I've got development, test, and staging, and I'm just expecting staging to be created. So we'll just run that. And there we go. So development and test already exist, and staging has been created. And you can see we've got our environment ID down here and all of the other properties just formatted in the way PowerShell likes. So last up for me is C#. So this script is functionally equivalent to the other two, probably has the most similarities with the PowerShell Octopus client because it's using it in the same way. Everything is very similar. It still checks for the existing environment, but this time we're going to be creating the production environment. So we'll run that. There we go. So just quickly head back to the Octopus instance when it wants to load. There we go. And here we have all of the environments. So development, that was created by our, just in the web portal itself. Environment test, that was done via Postman. Test was done by the PowerShell REST script. Staging by the Octopus client script. And finally, production in C#. So you might be thinking that this is all great, but you've got grander plans than just creating environments. Where can you find some more advanced examples? And Leanne kind of alluded to it slightly earlier, and we've got great API resources available. So we've got both the API examples section of our documentation, handily here, for a good blue Peter moment, and it's on the adding environments as well. And what this does is it gives you a description. It also tells you what parameters you should provide. And in addition, you get different versions of the script. So here we've got the PowerShell REST version, as well as the Octopus client, C#, but we also do have Python. And I think, Leanne, am I right in thinking we've also got some Golang examples as well?
We have. They're sporadically around sort of as we get to them, but when you get into the Git repository, which I think you're just about to look at, they are grouped, aren't they?
That's right. So the second place that we've got is our Octopus Deploy API GitHub repo. And you don't need to jot these links down. We'll send them in the post-webinar email to you. But you're quite right. So here we've got the REST PowerShell version. So my add environment script is here. But if I navigate to the root and then go to Octopus client, you could also see that we've got PowerShell, C# versions of using the Octopus client and back to the REST versions. And you can see we've got Golang, PowerShell, Python, and even some Ruby. So Leanne, that is my demo of different ways to call the API. I shall hand it back to you.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
So I can imagine your brain's starting to go off now and think, all right, okay, I can think of a few things I can start writing scripts on now, and sort of how you can sort of reduce those tasks that you have to complete maybe on a regular basis. So let's first of all just have a little bit of a chat about the tasks that we do here at Octopus. So we quite regularly spin up transient environments for samples or maybe for test environments. And so as part of that, we have either a script step on Octopus or on the tentacle itself that calls into the API and performs that tentacle registration. So that's sort of a completely hands-off task. Another one is performing routine Octopus admin tasks. So for my home lab, I've got a server set up for my main instance, but I've also got another instance running in Docker that calls in and does sort of backups of my Octopus instance, upgrades, setting global retention policies, that sort of thing, tentacle upgrades. And I think that's sort of quite a really nice way to use those sort of things. So, those API tasks. Project compliance checks, which is something that Mark touched upon. Sort of making sure that you've got, maybe you want to ensure you have manual interventions for your production deployments, those sorts of things in every project, then you can set up some sort of script that would do those checks. And as Mark alluded to earlier, he's a great fan of step templates, sort of to extend what we have within Octopus a little bit and share it and make it, really reusable, both within your own Octopus sort of company or whatever, but also you could publish those onto the community library, and many, many more. Anything specific that I've missed there, Mark?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head with the main points. For me, I don't like to do anything manually more than once. So I think for me the main ones are I've got IMLab as well. So Octopus updates frequently. So like I like to use a personal cloud instance of Octopus to actually update my Octopus instance, but part of that is because it's a HA setup. I have it, set it up in maintenance mode, then do a SQL backup and all those kind of bits, talking to the API. And I touched on it slightly before. I also make use of the Let's Encrypt step templates so that I can always make sure that my SL certs are renewed as part of that, including for my HA setup. Just today, I was doing some scripting to generate a large amount of data for a test I was doing for certificates. So I needed to create like 5,000 certificates in Octopus, and me being me, I decided to put them in the default space rather than putting them in a separate kind of partitioned wall. So I was like, oh, well, this is unfortunate. So what do? Well, I'll write another script to delete all of these 5,000 certificates, because I can tell you I don't want to be doing that 5,000 times. So it's really it's a really nice way of just automating those kind of, if I'm honest, slightly mundane tasks. To
Absolutely,
particularly where I'm at fault, So yeah,
definitely. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of examples. So I'm going to go with a sample that I was looking at with a customer fairly recently, where they, like Mark, wanted to set up those compliance checks on their projects. They were starting to get their dev teams to start to use Octopus and set up their own deployment process. But as part of that, they wanted to make sure that they were adhering to certain things within that project process. So let's take this example here, Project Green. I've just done a sample couple of steps in here. So first of all, I always want the first step to be this security polling check. And I always want this last check to be post-deployment checks. So Project Green, they've been fantastic. They've set that up lovely. Project Red, got a few maverick developers who just go ahead and create their projects and don't check those things. So that's something where we need to go along and add those steps in for them.
Not quite happy with the way you assumed you're looking at me then when you were talking about the maverick developers there.
Can't mention any names there, Mark. Can't mention any names. Okay, so Project Yellow, they've done fairly well with their first step there, but they've not put that final post-deployment checks on. And just a final one here, this Project Blue, they've put their post-deploy checks in, but not that early check. So if we move across, I've got this script here that is using the Octopus client DLL, like Mark showed us, to create the environment. And so it's setting up a few variables at the beginning here. So first of all, it's setting that URI and the API key. Obviously, don't want to be storing this in source control, so don't do that. And the settings here, so we're only going to look at this one specific space within Octopus. And here I've specified those 4 projects I want to look at. Now, you might want to iterate through every project within that space. It really depends on what your specific use case is. Next, I refer to those 2 step templates that I want to use in each of these projects. So I've just got the name of those step templates, and I've just, for this example, I've named them something very slightly different, just because that was the requirement. There's a couple extra variables that are set here. I'm not going to go into the details of those. As I said, we have some really awesome getting started guides. So if you're not familiar with some of these terms, please go and look at that. This will all become very much simpler if you get that key terminology. Okay, so the code itself, we've got two functions. First of all, we've got this get added already status. So first of all, I'm going to find out whether this step exists already in the project. And the other thing is that I'm going to find out, so once I've found out, if it's not there, I'm going to then add that step in. So this function adds the step in, sets a number of the properties that are required, and pushes that using the modify, deployment processes modify. Final section down here, this is looping through each of those projects, and it's checking, first of all, to make sure whether those steps exist. And an additional bit of logic here, if that first step within the deployment process is a manual intervention, it's going to add that pre-step after that manual intervention. And then it's going to add in the step, the first step in the process. And something else to note, because we're doing two updates potentially to this deployment process, in between the first update and the second update, we need to reload that deployment process because we can't, otherwise the second update, that will cause an error saying you're trying to update an out-of-date document. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that process. So we're going to run that script. Okay, so Project Red, our worst offender, you can see it's gone ahead and it's added both of those steps into the project. Let's go over to Octopus and we can just take a look. So that was it prior to our updates. If we then go ahead and update the page, you can see it's got that first step and last step added in. So as we go through, we can see Project Blue didn't add that second step, but it needed to add the other one. Project Green didn't add either of them. And again, Project Yellow, just the one. So for completeness, let's just double check that. So Project Yellow, yep, that has both of those steps. Project Blue is slightly different. We've got a manual intervention here. So what's happened is, because of that logic in that script, we've been able to identify that actually we want it added at step 2. Okay. So there you go. So you can obviously completely change that to the criteria that you have. It might be that you've got a number of things. Maybe you want to say, yep, the step's there, but it's disabled. Make sure it's always disabled. Or, you know, they've got the step in there, but it's not at the right location in that deployment process. There's so many, you know, it's endless, the possibilities there, but that just gives you an idea of a sort of starting point.
Plus, you can save my bacon there, Leanne, you know, on the Red project team, you know.
Yeah. Get you through the audit.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's take a look at our second instance here, our second script example. We've got a project here that every now and then just happens to run and run and run these tasks, and we're not quite sure why. Something seems to make them hang and they just go on for hours. So in this case, rather than have people come to you as an Octopus administrator and ask you to cancel those tasks, what you can do is set up a process to run on a schedule and check for any of these long-running tasks and cancel them. So I've set this up in my separate Octopus instance. The reason for that is these long-running tasks may have taken up all of the deployment tasks in your Octopus node. So this runbook will potentially not get to the head of the queue in order for it to be able to cancel those tasks. So we're going in, and this is, like I just mentioned, is a runbook. So a runbook is something we introduced about over a year ago now, actually, where you can come in and you can create, as we said, runbooks to do those tasks that aren't necessarily deployments, but they're for those sort of maintenance operations, maybe database backups or rebooting servers or restarting web apps or things like that. And exactly this sort of thing, identifying and cancel long-running tasks. So I haven't got this running on a scheduled trigger purely because I didn't want it to do it just in the middle as I was about to demo it. But what I would generally do for this is set it running on a regular trigger, say maybe every couple of hours or something like that. If we go into the process, I've got 2 steps. The first one is a script step. and you can see it could have been written in any of these languages here. I've chosen PowerShell, and if we expand that, we can take a look at the code itself. So the first thing to note about one of the really good points of running these scripts from within a runbook is the fact that we can store that API key within a sensitive variable within Octopus. So it will remain encrypted, and at no point will we accidentally check it into source control or something like that. It's always going to remain encrypted. And we've also got that URL there, so that URL is going to be pulled, but it could be that maybe you run it against various different Octopus instances, so it makes it more reusable. So the next variable here is max runtime. This is a value in minutes, so I'm basically going to say any of those tasks that have been running for 15 minutes or more, I want to cancel. So this is looking through all spaces on the instance that we're specifying. And what it's doing is saying for each space, I'd like to go through and get all of those executing tasks. Now, you can note here that we've filtered that tasks call by only getting those executing tasks. So tasks could be pretty numerous, and this is sort of one of those features we were talking about to, reduce the amount of data coming back from those REST calls. And then it loops through each of those tasks it gets back and determines the number of minutes that that task has been running for. And if it's been running for greater than the number of minutes specified, so as you've got here, the max runtime, it will call the tasks cancel endpoint and cancel that task. And it sets a couple of variables here so that if it does cancel any, it will run the Slack notification step, which is the second step here, and let us know. So let's just check those tasks are still running. Yeah. So we'll run this runbook. Okay, so it's found those two tasks and cancelled them. And then it sent out that Slack notification. And we can see here, it's actually told us exactly which ones it is. So this is where you can you don't have to go in and check on these things. You can leave these to run and happily be confident things are being checked without having to constantly log in and see what's going on.
And Leanne, so when you are executing that runbook, the API key that you're using, does that get tracked anywhere in the other Octopus instance you've got, just to so people can see who cancelled those tasks?
So that's a really good point. So if we go and look at this cancelled task here, this the runbook that I was running in my other instance was using an API key that was associated with one of those service accounts that I showed you earlier. So we can see that's who it's associated with, so admin tasks. So likewise, where it was kicked off earlier by myself, it just shows who did what. So you still get that full audit trail.
Nice, exactly the same as if you're doing it in the web portal yourself. I like it.
Right.
Nice. Okay. Right, so I think it's time for questions next. So we did something a little bit different a couple of weeks ago with questions, where we had a third person hidden away curating some questions for us. So I'm hoping Adam is still here today to help us with that. Adam, do we have any questions?
Hello, Mark. Yes, I am here, and we do have a couple of questions.
Excellent.
So I'll give you the first one. So is it possible to get API keys using the API?
Leanne, do you want to take
No. In a word, no. You can't retrieve those because along the same lines as Mark alluded to with the account passwords, we don't return any sensitive values. So any of those encrypted values from the database, none of those are retrievable via the API.
Excellent. Second question from Scott. So it's around API key expiry. Can an administrator set an API key expiry date globally? So, for example, all keys are only valid for 90 days. So nobody can just kind of pick a custom expiry date and set that globally instead.
Should I take this one, Mark?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
No, that is not something that's possible at the moment. However, that's probably worth mentioning to our product team to see if there's any appetite for that, because I can see that being fairly useful feature actually. So thank you.
Yeah, like almost like having like an API key policy, isn't it? Like, you know, you can have certain things like you can almost see like, you know, I'd fall foul of this policy though, like, you know, where you can't use the word testing in your description for your API key. So actually, perhaps I won't suggest that to the product team.
Excellent. I think that answers that one. Next one. Is it possible to query the Octopus API for audit data? Obviously, in Octopus, you can go into the audit screen and check out all the events that have happened. Can you get that from the API?
You absolutely can, yes. So we'll just go to Octopus first and just go to configuration. And we'll just go to the audit screen. And this is where a lot of that audit information obviously is shown. You can see I've been creating many environments to date. And we'll go back to the Swagger UI and I will just look for the events endpoint. So it's important to note that, oh, where's it gone? There it is. It's important to note that although the feature or the page is called audit, that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a one-to-one correlation with the name of that screen versus the REST API. So the audit event uses the events endpoint, and you know, just to show that I'm not lying, we can go here, hit refresh in the same way that we did earlier, and then you can see down here that we've got this event call. So come to headers, API events. So if I actually take a look at just the events themselves, here they are. Again, no surprise that most of these are about environments being created, but also it tells you, you know, what identity was established with. So that's that API key kind of tracking again. But what you can also do is, if I go back to here, we can take the query.
That's a really good point, actually. You can use, say you wanted to add those query strings on there, you can add use the filters in the UI to help you out. Sorry, I probably jumped the gun there, Mark.
No, absolutely. So you can see we've got 306 events here. And if we put those on there as well, you then get 258, showing that it's been filtered as well. Hopefully that answers the question for you, Adam.
It does, and it's definitely thrown me before searching for audit, and actually I should be looking for events. So great question.
And I guess I was going to say just one other thing to mention about the audit. Obviously, that table can grow as you know you use Octopus more and more. So, kind of going back to what Leanne said, it's really a good idea to try and be as highly selective as you can. What that will do is it will generate a more selective SQL query, and therefore the data will be returned in a more efficient manner, and make use of paging, of course. Sorry.
Well, I'm just checking. I think that is just about it for the questions. So I'll hand back over to yourself and Leanne. Back to the webinar.
Thank you, Adam, for that. So that's us almost done. As we mentioned at the start, we are recording this webinar. We'll send the recording out in the next 24 to 48 hours. That includes some links to resources from today's webinar. Leanne, thank you again for helping me show off the REST API. I really enjoyed it.
Yep, me too. Thanks, Mark.
No worries. A couple of final things for me quickly. If you are new to using the API and need any advice, please do drop the solutions team an email at advice@octopus.com and we'll be happy to help you out. And lastly, we've got a couple of webinars coming up next month. So first up is Release Management with Octopus. That's with Bob Walker and Adam Close on the 10th of March. And then 2 weeks later, we have Deploying to Kubernetes using Rancher with our resident Kubernetes expert, Sean. And I'll be coming along mainly just for the ride to ask a few questions. That's on the 24th of March. So as always, some great topics coming up. Hopefully we'll see you there. Thank you, everyone.